Today we're looking at the Dred Scott case. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. Also, I'd love to see your answer to question number 5 in the comments below. So the Dred Scott case is one of the most decisive and wrong decisions the U.S. Supreme Court has ever made, and it's really one of the big issues that eventually leads us to the Civil War. Dred Scott was an African American born into slavery in 1799 in Southampton County, Virginia. Now, if you remember anything about history, Southampton County, Virginia is, of course, where the Nat Turner Rebellion takes place in 1831. Scott was not involved in that because by 1830, he had moved to St. Louis, Missouri with his slave owner, a man named Peter Blow, who then died in 1832. Now, when Peter Blow dies, Dred Scott is then purchased by an army surgeon named Dr. John Emerson. And now Emerson is then assigned to Fort Armstrong, which was in Rock Island, Illinois. And Emerson brought Dred Scott along with him into Illinois. And while there, Dred Scott met another slave named Harriet, and they were married. And now Harriet and Dred Scott now both belong to John Emerson. From there, Emerson was assigned to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, and he took both Dred and Harriet with him there as well. Now, you might be asking yourself, how on earth could Emerson bring slaves with him into free territory? Because Illinois was a free state, Wisconsin, it was illegal to have slaves. You got to think about at the time, a lot of people just kind of turned a blind eye to it. Most Northerners were not opposed to slavery because it was morally wrong, which it is morally wrong. They were opposed to it for economic reasons. So they didn't necessarily, call anybody or say anything about it. They just kind of turned the other way. But in 1843, Dr. Emerson suddenly died at the age of 40, and the ownership of the Scotts transferred to Emerson's widow, Irene Emerson, in St. Louis. But in 1846, the Scotts sued Irene Emerson for their freedom in Missouri courts, because there was a Missouri law that said if a slave has lived in a free territory or free state, they cannot be returned into slavery in a slave state. So it goes to court. And of course, to have a lawsuit, it cost a lot of money to be able to have a lawsuit. And the Scotts just simply did not have much money. So they were supported by their church. They were supported by abolitionist groups in St. Louis. And surprisingly, they were supported by the family of Peter Blow, who, remember, was the original slave owner. That family, they were actually abolitionists. But in 1850, the Missouri court sided with the Scotts and said, yes, you are now free. However, Irene Emerson appealed that decision, and it went to the Missouri Supreme Court, and there the Missouri Supreme Court reversed the decision and put the Scotts back into slavery. So by 1853, Irene had transferred the Scotts over to her brother, John Sanford, although she still technically owned them. And in 1853, Dred Scott files again another lawsuit, but this time in the U.S. federal court. And so the case officially becomes known as Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the federal court ruled against Scott. But now he appealed that decision, and now it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, by this point, this case is really becoming national news because the Supreme Court had never handed down a decision concerning slavery. But we got to look at it. The Supreme Court at this time was full of a lot of Southerners, a lot of slave owners, a lot of guys who were in favor of slavery, such as Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who is the one who actually hands down the decision on March 6th of 1857. Now, this decision is absolutely offensive and absolutely wrong. What the Supreme Court decided, they said that Dred Scott never had the right to sue in the first place because he was property. He was not a citizen of the United States, so he had no right to sue. They went even further then and said that slaves were property, and that slaves were protected by the Constitution, and to deny slavery in any territory anywhere is unconstitutional. So it's basically repealing the Missouri Compromise, saying it was unconstitutional, and it's basically implying that anywhere that are laws against slavery, that those laws are unconstitutional. So this is a bombshell. I mean, this is people in the country are just going nuts now, like, well, are you kidding me? The Supreme Court has now said that outlawing slavery is unconstitutional. But let me stress again, just because the Supreme Court makes a decision does not necessarily mean they're right. And this is a prime example of them being absolutely wrong. All right. But what's interesting is that about the same time, President James Buchanan is accepting the pro-slavery Lecompton State Constitution from Kansas. Remember, Bleeding Kansas is going on, and we have the pro-slavery groups who have held basically a fraudulent election and are writing a constitution that is pro-slavery. So this, again, contributes to the mess that is going on here after the Dred Scott decision. Now, on a positive note, though, however, by the time the decision was handed down, Irene Emerson had remarried a guy named Calvin Chaffee, who was a U.S. congressman and an abolitionist. And when he realized that Irene still owned Dred and Harriet, he immediately sold them to Taylor Blow, who was the son of Peter Blow, the original slave owner, and Taylor immediately sets them free on May 26th of 1857. And they lived there in St. Louis for a short period of time, but Dred died in 1858 at the age of 59 of tuberculosis. But his name would forever live as a symbol of the fight for freedom and the case that divided the nation. So hopefully you learned something there, and thanks for watching.